Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, before I begin, I just want to take a moment to say that my thoughts and prayers go out to the good people in Boston and other areas where they've had these tremendous and horrific events and attacks. And I hope and pray that all of those whose lives are impacted by these tragic events will have a swift and peaceful recovery. In addition, I want to commend all the law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation that brought the hunt for the perpetrators to a successful end. Now, Mr. President, over the last few months, I've come to the floor several times to discuss the need for the Senate to return to regular order. If the last several years have taught us anything, it's that efforts to force legislation through the Senate without full and fair consideration tend to yield unsatisfying results. Complaints about the lack of bipartisanship have more or less become the norm around here, and we hear all the time about the desire for the so-called grand bargains. But, Mr. President, bipartisan agreements don't just happen. And I think we all agree grand bargains can't be made out of thin air. Luckily, the Senate already has a system in place for fostering these types of agreements. It's called regular order. Yet today, the Senate will vote on cloture on the motion to proceed to the so-called Marketplace Fairness Act. And in doing so, the Senate will once again abandon regular order in favor of the whims of the Senate Democratic leadership. Now, this is a bill that falls under the jurisdiction of the Senate Finance Committee. But the committee has not had a markup on the bill. Instead, the Marketplace Fairness Act is just the latest in a long line of bills brought before the full Senate without due consideration in the Committee of Jurisdiction. Mr. President, this has become far too common. I understand that there are those who feel strongly about this legislation, and I admire and respect the sponsors of the bill who have worked hard to address what they see as a major problem in our nation's tax policy. But that simply isn't enough to justify yet another adjudication of or abdication of the committee process here in the Senate. The Senate is organized into various committees of jurisdiction so that members are able to develop and utilize their own expertise on specific issues. When a piece of legislation goes through the committee process, it is thoroughly vetted and examined. This provides an opportunity to resolve technical issues and address various concerns before the bill is brought to the floor for a vote. Regular order is not a process designed to protect the power of committee chairmen and ranking members. We have regular order in our committee structure so that we have an organized way of ensuring that our constituents are fully represented and to make sure that the legislation that we pass is technically sound. The legislation we'll be voted on today is a perfect example of the importance of regular order. The Marketplace Fairness Act is a bill that will have a significant impact on millions of consumers and businesses throughout the country, and clearly this is no trifling matter. Most reasonable people would agree that a bill of this magnitude would benefit from full and fair committee consideration, including a markup, with an open debate and an opportunity to vote on amendments before it's brought to the floor. However, being reasonable doesn't appear to be part of the equation on the floor today. Now, I want to stress that I'm not fundamentally opposed to this legislation. My goal is not to stop it at all costs. Instead, I simply want to ensure that it is fully vetted and examined. And I know that if all sides are able to look at this in a dispassionate way, we might find ways of bringing all sides together. That's not going to happen the way it's being done now. Therefore, today's vote is, in my view, at least as much a vote on regular order as it is a vote on the underlying bill. That said, I do have some specific concerns about the legislation as it is currently drafted. To begin with, the Marketplace Fairness Act in its current form is a fairly short 11 pages long. This bill essentially provides two avenues for states to compel remote sellers or out-of-state businesses to collect and remit sales and use taxes. Under the bill, a state may either meet specified minimum requirements or be a member state under the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement as long as the minimum requirements are met under the agreement. The Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement is a good deal more complicated than the Marketplace Fairness Act. For starters, at 203 pages, the agreement is about 18 times longer. Since its adoption on November 12, 2002, the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement has been amended 28 times, most recently just last year. It's not a simple little problem here. The Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board has done excellent work in bringing states together to cooperatively and voluntarily address the issues of sales and use tax complexity and administration, just to mention a few issues. According to the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board, 24 states have adopted the simplification measures in the agreement, representing 31% of the population. The authors of the Marketplace Fairness Act hope to apply its measures to all 50 states and 100% of the population. However, the bill is comparatively short on details. For example, the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement contains provisions on rules for the sourcing of sales, along with exclusions to those rules. In order to levy the appropriate sales tax, you must determine the location and subject matter of the transaction. This level of detail is not present in the Marketplace Fairness Act. It is unclear if the floor established on sourcing requirements under this bill is sufficient to protect consumers from unintended consequences. For example, I've received a letter from the American Society of Pension Professionals and Actuaries who are worried that this legislation, quote, would allow states to impose a financial transaction tax that would apply to American workers' 401k contributions and other transactions within workers' accounts, unquote. Another concern I have with the current version of the Marketplace Fairness Act is that it contains a presumption clause which could make it possible for states to expand the reach of their sales taxes through creative legislating. While the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement at least provides an avenue for the input of multiple states, the states that are not subject to the agreement would, under this bill, be able to legislate knowing that the federal government will compel enforcement of their tax laws on non-residents. I am also concerned with the potential transition costs that will come with this legislation. Retailers have been operating in an environment where they have not been required to collect and remit sales taxes for states where they do not have a physical presence. This legislation would change that almost in an instant. Before we enact a new sales tax system, we need to take into account the costs that system will impose on businesses of all sizes and the difficulties those countries or these companies will face as they adapt to the new regime. For example, there is the issue of vendor compensation. The Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement currently includes a provision giving states the opportunity to voluntarily compensate remote sellers, quote, as a measure of good faith, unquote, for registering to voluntarily collect and remit sales taxes into states where the seller has no physical presence. This is included in the agreement because under current law, remote sellers are generally not required to collect and remit the sales tax, and they incur a cost when doing so. The Marketplace Fairness Act does not include any provision for compensation of remote sellers. I believe this is something we must take into account and examine even more thoroughly. I'm also concerned about the small seller exemption in the bill, which would exempt sellers with national remote sales of less than $1 million from the new requirements to collect and withhold sales taxes. This seems like an important concession, but it is not without its problems. First of all, the cap on the exemption is not indexed to inflation. I think anyone who has observed any part of the roughly 50-year process where the alternative minimum tax has grown from a fairness measure targeting the rich, 155 millionaires, I guess, to an ever-increasing burden on the middle class. They should understand how inflation can radically distort policy outcomes over a period of time. In addition, there are many who argue that the $1 million exemption may be too low. In my view, these are concerns that we need to fully consider before bringing the bill to the floor. Finally, I want to point out that the bill does not include a provision for dispute resolution, for a dispute resolution venue. Ideally, the bill would give federal district courts exclusive jurisdiction in matters concerning the implementation of this legislation. Policy changes with such far-reaching effects inevitably lead to unexpected issues and consequences. Giving federal courts this jurisdiction would ensure greater uniformity and application of this legislation across the country. Mr. President, these are just a few of the concerns I have regarding the Marketplace Fairness Act. I don't believe that these are necessarily fundamental concerns, but they are issues that need to be addressed. I am quite certain that if given an opportunity, the Finance Committee could address these issues without inexorably changing the underlying purpose of the bill. However, if we proceed with floor debate on the Marketplace Fairness Act as is, we will not have that opportunity. The Senate just simply cannot continue to operate this way. Once again, we need to restore the deliberative traditions of the Senate. That means a return to regular order. I know a number of my colleagues have expressed similar concerns about the need to restore the committee process in the Senate. I hope they will join with me in voting no on cloture on the motion to proceed to the Marketplace Fairness Act today. That doesn't necessarily determine how I'm going to vote in the final analysis of this. But I sure as heck would like to approach it in a much more intelligent and legislatively profound way than we're doing here tonight. And by the way, you can talk about the fairness of this thing, but there are a lot of states that aren't quite convinced that this is as fair as those who are supporting the bill actually claim. Mr. President, I hope that we can have a more deliberative time to examine these matters. The distinguished chairman of the committee has offered to have a hearing on the bill, to mark up the bill, and to consider it in a regular order approach in the immediate future, as soon as we get back from this next recess. And frankly, I think that's a pretty good offer. And it's one that we ought to honor if we honor our committee structure in the United States Senate. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the
Senator from Tennessee.